Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, we're going to speak with the journalist that is reporting on what seems to be a cover up pertaining to a senior advisor to the Saudi royal family and their possible connection to some of the 9/11 hijackers in Florida.
Hi, this is John, and I'm here with Dan Christensen. Dan, how are you doing today?
Hi, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. All right, so I'm going to read your bio for everybody. Dan founded Florida Bulldog in 2009 using the name Broward Bulldog. He is an award-winning former investigative reporter for the Miami Herald and Daily Business Review, and one of South Florida's most experienced reporters. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science from the University of Miami. Dan's stories about Broward Sheriff Ken Jenne's private business dealings sparked a federal corruption investigation that landed Jenne in prison in 2007. His stories about hidden and falsified court records in Broward, Miami-Dade, and elsewhere in Florida for the Miami Herald in 2006 led to a pair of unanimous Florida Supreme Court decisions in 2007 and 2010 outlawing those practices. Similar stories for the Daily Business Review in 2003 and 2004 exposed excessive secrecy in federal courts. The executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press later called Dan, quote, the nation's leading journalist on an issue of tremendous First Amendment importance, the increasing trend towards secrecy in our nation's courts, end quote. In 2000-2001, Dan's reporting about a deadly gun planting conspiracy and cover-up by Miami police resulted in the indictment of more than a dozen officers and significant governmental reform, including the establishment of Miami's long-sought civilian review panel. So, very impressive. That's your bio. All right, so we're going to get right into the questions. Number one, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Well, it was a sort of a regular day for me. I was working at the Daily Business Review, which is a publication in South Florida that focuses on legal and business news. So when 9/11 happened, the paper that I worked for didn't cover it. Per se. It was, I was like everybody else, I probably watched a lot of it unfold on television and in the daily newspapers, which at the time were pretty aggressive in covering it. So it was it was basically a day where I was on the sidelines. It wasn't until years later that I first got involved with all this.
Well, okay, what was the first thing you questioned about the 9/11 attacks?
Well, the first thing was when Anthony Summers contacted me in August of 2011. He and his wife, Robin Swan, wrote a book called The 11th Day, which was, it's a really good read account of what happened and events surrounding 9/11. And the book had just gone to press or was just about to go to press. And I've known Tony for a long time. He and his wife live in Ireland. So he contacted me since I'm in Florida and said, I've got this lead and couldn't get it into the book. You want to help me report it out? And I said, sure. And I've been on it ever since.
Okay, so with regards to the 11th day, and this is probably something I should be bringing up with Anthony Summers, but I just want to mention it. There's no doubt that elements within what's called the 9/11 truth movement promoted bad information and bad theories, and some acted in ways that didn't help us in the long run. That being said, I didn't like how he treated the 9/11 truth movement in his book. He went after the weakest links to denounce us, and in the same book used the work of people like Paul Thompson and John Judge and Kevin Fenton, people who would be considered members of the quote-unquote 9/11 truth movement. So good or bad, it was the 9/11 truth movement that did its best to bring attention to the family members fighting for accountability and justice, and it was the 9/11 truth movement that did its best to bring attention to the sick and dying 9/11 first responders. And, we've been covering issues like Saudi Arabia and the 28 redacted pages for years, along with a multitude of other issues. So, I never had the opportunity to speak with him, but I just left a bad taste.
I can assure you that Tony is a top flight professional reporter, and I realized there was a section on this in which he looked at a number of different things involving what you would call the 9/11 truth movement, and he discounted some of their theories. And,
absolutely. I believe me. I know. I know there are many theories out there that can be easily discredited and so forth. But there's another faction that supported the families, that were asking questions and demanding answers, and we're there from the beginning, helping the families fight for the 9/11 Commission and all that stuff. So,
all right.
Anyway.
Well, I will tell you this. I think Tony's I wouldn't have associated with him if I didn't think this. He's an honest guy who calls him like he sees him, and
okay.
right or wrong.
No,
that's all you can ask
fine.
of anyone.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Now, can you please give us an overview of the story concerning what happened in Sarasota?
All right. Well, the story begins when Tony spoke with the person that ultimately became our principal, but not only, source for the very first story that ran, I believe it was on September 8th, 2011. And it ran on, it was then Broward Bulldog.org and is now Florida Bulldog.org. We changed the name a few months ago. Sort of reflect the scope. Broward is the name of the county where I am based, and we ended up writing stories that were more than just about Broward, so that's why we changed the name. Anyway, the story that we initially wrote about this was the same day that we published it. The Miami Herald purchased it and published it, so a lot of times you Google around, you'll see it as if it was a Miami Herald story or if it was some different story, but it wasn't. They simply purchased our story and ran it as they have with a number of subsequent stories over the last 4 years. But the story begins with this meeting in which this counterintelligence agent spilled the beans, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, on what had happened, and was concerned about it and thought that it needed to come out. Wasn't looking for glory or anything else, just telling what happened. And it was so surprising because not a word of this had come out anywhere before. And so Tony had the story, and we developed it a bit, and we went to Senator Bob Graham, who used to be the governor of Florida, and for 2 terms, and after that was a senator, head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was in the Senate for 3 terms, and briefly he had a run for president back in 2004. And we took this information to him, and he was quite surprised and frankly upset about it, because he felt, rightly so I believe, that the FBI should have told them about their investigation of these people, what we call the Sarasota Saudi family. And the gist of what happened here, or was alleged to have happened, is that there were a family of Saudis who had lived in the Sarasota area in a development called Christensen, which is actually just outside the city limits of Sarasota on the south side. It's an upscale community, and they had a home in there, and had lived there for 5-6 years before that. The home was owned by it was Mr. and Mrs. Al-Hiji. Abdul Aziz was the husband, and The wife's name was Anoud. Anoud's father, this guy named Issam Ghazawi, who was an advisor to one of the princes in the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, so the story sort of begins on the ground level here when, after 9/11, neighbors start calling the authorities to report that these people had left abruptly a couple of weeks before, but had moved out basically, but had left behind their furniture, cars, food in the refrigerator. They left their pool. They left their pool pump running, stuff like that. So it took a little while, a few weeks, I think, or maybe even a month or so, for state and federal agents to go in the place. But when they did, they found all this. And we even found like dirty diapers. I mean, it looked like they went out for a while, but in fact they had left the country. And on that basis, an investigation began into what had happened, and we were told by this intelligence officer or agent that they had done what you would expect to be typical police work. Since it was a gated community, they went to the gatehouse. They got records of people coming and going. They took photographs of license tags. They did logs of people coming and going. And they found through those logs and through those license tags the cars driven by some of the hijackers, including Muhammad Atta, had gone through there and had visited that home. There were some others too, including a guy named Adnan Shukrajuma, who lived here in Broward County for a while, in the town of Miramar, and later became very well known as an operative, senior operative for Al Qaeda. He was reportedly killed by the Pakistani government a couple of months ago. Anyway, they find this out. They do phone, they do what they call link analysis on the phone records, trying to find out who made calls, and they found, not necessarily, and we don't know all the details of this, but they didn't find necessarily calls from Muhammad Atta going to the home, but calls that the link analysis determined that Muhammad Atta and other folks would call numbers that also, had calls in and out of this particular home. That's how it was described to us. So we have these very interesting findings, yet none of this was reported to the 9/11 Commission or to Bob Graham's, not Bob Graham's, he was co-chair, but the committee that he led, the joint inquiry that was put together by Congress in the months after 9/11 to do an inquiry into what happened, essentially. And he, as I said, when we spoke to him about this, he was quite concerned that he hadn't been told about this. He subsequently did checking on his own, and he's told us that this information was never passed on to his committee. It wasn't like there was an oversight or something. Nobody knew about this, and nobody knew about it. The 9/11 Commission, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, there's no reference to what happened there. So, in there.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, the family that left, the Saudi family that left, were they ever questioned outside of the United States?
Well, we have been told by the FBI that they were questioned. We don't know this, where, when, particularly. It does appear from some of the documents that the FBI subsequently released on this that Mrs. Al-Hiji was questioned at one point when she returned to the home with her mother a couple of years after 9/11 to sell the property. They were there for, a month or so. And but we can't be, the records that we've got are too sketchy to know what's going on. Which sort of leads to the second part of the story, is that we're currently pursuing a Freedom of Information lawsuit with the Justice Department and the FBI trying to open up the file to see what's going on. And the FBI has told us that there's nothing to all this. They've said this on a number of occasions, but they are unwilling to explain the basis for that opinion and or that declaration. And we're, frankly, I am quite prepared to believe there was nothing to all this if they are willing to explain why. But so far, they haven't done that.
Well, with regards to the FBI cooperating with regards to 9/11 investigations, are you familiar with the site historycommons.org?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. This is an entry that was from History Commons. It's called Summer 2003, FBI Reluctance Over Saudi Connection Leads to Complaint from 9/11 Commissioner. And it says, the FBI is initially reluctant to provide documents to the 9/11 Commission team investigating possible links between hijackers Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi on the one hand and some Saudi government officials on the other. And the investigators, Michael Jacobson, Raj Day, and Hyan Kim, have come to believe that, in author Philip Sheenan's words, there could be, quote, few innocent explanations for why so many Saudis and other Arab men living in Southern California had come forward to help the two hijackers, to help them find a home, to set up bank accounts, to travel, end quote. Jacobson previously worked on the 9/11 congressional inquiry and formed the opinion then that FBI officials had tried to hide much of the evidence in its files linked to al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi. It goes on to say that at first, according to Sheenan, the FBI, quote, is as uncooperative with the 9/11 Commission as it had been in the congressional investigation, end quote, and is, quote, painfully slow to meet the Commission's initial request for documents and interviews, end quote. The three investigators want a formal protest to be made over the foot dragging, but realize their team leader, Dietrich Snell, will not make one due to what they perceive to be overcaution on his part. Therefore, they approach 9/11 Commissioner and former Deputy Attorney General Jamie Grelick, and she then contacts FBI Director Robert Mueller, warning him he will lose the Commission's goodwill if he does not start cooperating. And then it goes on to say later that in the spring of 2004, Mueller will launch a charm offensive against the Commission and will make significant efforts to comply with its request. And so that's one instance of the FBI being uncooperative with regards to the 9/11 investigations. And,
well, clearly, Senator Graham believes that they have not merely been uncooperative. He was interviewed by the New York Times this month, and in a story that ran, a week, 10 days ago, he referred to what it is that he perceives them to be doing as, quote, aggressive deception, unquote. That it's not merely attempting to cover up what happened, but attempting to deceive people about it. And frankly, that may be what's happening in another matter involving the Bulldog and its reporting.
What do you mean, as far as what?
Well, as far as I assume that you're familiar with the 9/11 Review Commission.
Yes, I am, sir.
As the FBI, I'm sure you are. As the FBI 9/11 Review Commission, and what it reported, it filed its one and apparently only report on all this week 10 days ago. I forget exactly when it was. And most of the report was basically mildly critical of the FBI regarding its response to 9/11 and how it's changed and what it's done and that sort of thing. For the most part, though, it was, I don't know, I felt it was somewhat cheerleading for the FBI, which isn't surprising given the fact that the FBI director was the guy who appointed the three members, one of whom includes former Attorney General Ed Meese, and also the FBI was paying the members. We do not know the terms of all that. We do know from the report that they were operating under personal services contracts with the FBI, but those contracts haven't been released yet. Actually, I filed a FOIA request trying to get my hands on that stuff, but so far I haven't gotten a response, from the FBI as to whether or not they're going to release that information. I've requested a lot of stuff, including transcripts of proceedings, things like that, reports that they relied on, memos that they used, the sorts of things that are done when a commission, like the 9/11 Commission or the Warren Commission, and no matter how criticized those commissions were, they did release a lot of information about what it was that they did. In this case, they haven't released anything except their report. And if you read that report, it becomes quite apparent that they were sort of under the FBI's thumb while they were doing this report.
Well, could you explain the formation of this commission? Because it was unknown to anybody until this report came out, as far as I know.
It was. I mean, there were. If you really looked around and were, sort of in retrospect, you could see that they were out there and functioning. But boy, you had to look pretty deep because there was no publicity about it. There was nothing in any newspapers that I could find. I did a pretty large search. Bob Graham didn't know anything about it, and a bunch of other people that I talked to. No one had ever heard about this. It wasn't. You can't quite say that it was completely incommunicado because they did appear before a congressional committee in a sort of a informal setting in a small room, it looked like. But it was done somewhat sub rosa here, and they didn't hold any public hearings. They did not have subpoena power. They were sort of spoon-fed the information that they got by the FBI. Now, the members certainly could ask their own questions about this, but when you read the report, it doesn't look like they did that very much. They simply relied on what the FBI told them for the most part in reaching their conclusions. And the part of this whole report that was most of interest to me was the part that had to do with the Sarasota situation, because in addition to looking at the FBI's performance post 9/11 in terms of how it operates, how it functions, is it protecting us, from terrorists? They also were charged with looking at any new evidence that came in and to make an assessment of that evidence as to whether or not there's anything there, and presumably to recommend, if they saw anything there, to recommend that there be further investigation. Anyway, in the course of all this, they looked at the Saudi situation, Sarasota Saudi situation, and frankly, they botched it. They looked at one particular document that was put out by an FBI agent that we obtained from the FBI in our FOIA lawsuit. Remember, it was released only after we sued them. Originally, we filed freedom of information requests and went for like a year, and they kept telling us they had no what they call responsive documents. Then all of a sudden, 6 months after we filed the lawsuit, I go out to the mailbox one day, and there's an envelope from the FBI, and there's like 30 pages in there. Among those pages, and they were all heavily redacted, there was one from April 2002, a report that talked about how these the names of the people, the players were all blacked out, but you could tell by reading it who they were talking about, and our request was all about the Al-Hijis here, the people that lived in that home. It said that they had many connections to people associated with the 9/11 attacks. And they went on to talk about how somebody in that family apparently trained alongside Ada and Al-Shehi, one of the other pilots, and perhaps Jara, the third pilot, at either Huffman Aviation or one of the other aviation training schools down in Venice, Florida, which is about 10 miles from where the Al-Hiji's home was in South Sarasota, essentially.
Okay, well, it reminds me, with regards to the 9/11 Review Commission, you described it as, quote, a secretive blue ribbon panel formed by Congress to conduct a external review of the FBI's post-9/11 performance and to assess new evidence, end quote, and said that it was, quote, largely under the sway of the very agency it was tasked to examine, end quote. So essentially, it was the FBI investigating itself. Now,
yes.
Originally, from what I read, the 9/11 Review Commission was presented with the idea of having subpoena power. They ended up not having subpoena power. Is that
yes.
correct?
Yeah, the idea for this was actually by New York Congressman
Peter King.
Peter King, thank you. Having a senior moment. Anyway, he had filed a bill back in 2011 calling for the establishment of a 9/11 Review Commission, which he and others seemed to envision would be led by the guys who were in charge of the 9/11 Review Commission, former Governor Keene and former Congressman Lee Hamilton. With the idea being that they would be best qualified to do this. Anyway, it was supposed to be an entity, national commission under the legislative branch, under Congress, and it was going to have subpoena power. This is all in the legislation. It was going to hold public hearings. Its administration was going to be run by the General Services Administration. And there was no inkling that the FBI would be involved in any way. That idea seemed not to get too much support in Congress, and the idea began to fizzle out at the end of 2012. However, sometime in the first 3 months of 2013, this became transformed into the entity that it became, meaning was part of the executive branch, in fact, basically under the FBI. The FBI was given, congressional funding, about $1 million to set this up. They had, Director Comey was the one who picked the 3 commissioners, quote unquote, in consultation with Congress, according to the report. They paid them. They helped staff them. They supplied virtually all the information that was used by the committee to reach its conclusions, and the FBI even ran the staff administratively. So they obviously had a huge input as to how this was done, and it seemed to me worthy of a story to point that out, because I haven't seen any other stories noting that they were really what I called under the FBI's thumb.
Well, it reminds me of, I don't know if you remember or recall, but NORAD lied a lot about 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission referred them to the Department of Defense Inspector General, and the Inspector General let them off the hook. And with regards to Able Danger, it was also referred to the Department of Defense Inspector General, and that was apparently let off the hook, like they didn't find what the people said they found, and so on and so forth. So it just, every time somebody investigates themselves, it seems like they get away with it.
Well, it's not a good, obviously, it's not a good idea to have an agency investigating its own situation here, and it's a recipe for a problem. And clearly Senator Graham believes that, and he's a man that I greatly admire.
Are you familiar with the story of Rudy Deckers with regards to Huffman Aviation, or the writings of Daniel Hopsicker?
I'm familiar with them. I'm not completely conversant in them. But
okay.
he thought that Deckers had some problems, I know. but it's not an avenue. He does, and I've spoken to Mr. Deckers a while back trying to see if I could get some information about flight school, one of the things that I've been trying to do is find out in that document, that April 2002 document that the FBI and the 9/11 Review Commission now both are trying to discredit. It talks about, the one that talks about how the family had many connections to 9/11 players. It talks about the fact that there was a member of that family who's unidentified who was affiliated with that flight school. So I was tempted to learn who that was. Didn't have much luck. And along the way, talked to Deckers trying to find out if he had any information about it. He indicated that he didn't. I got the impression he was telling me the truth, but who knows?
Right. Well, Daniel Hopsicker's book, it essentially portrays Atta as a drinking, drug-taking party animal, strongly contradicting the conventional view of Atta having been a devout Muslim. It also implicates retired businessman Wally Hilliard, the owner of Huffman Aviation, as the owner of a Learjet that in July 2000 was seized by federal agents after they found 43 pounds of heroin on board. Now, this gained credibility because on December 13th, 2012, the Tampa Tribune reported that, quote, a year after he published a book about his travails, the owner of a flight school where two 9/11 hijackers trained has been arrested in Houston on cocaine trafficking charges. A federal judge last week ordered Rudy Deckers held without bond pending his trial, partially because the Netherlands citizen poses a risk of flight. Deckers was a chief executive officer and president of Huffman Aviation in Venice, where 9/11 terrorists Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehhi enrolled as students, end quote. So
I know nothing about that.
Okay. Now, the next part of this question, and the reason I brought that up, it has to do with this next part of this question, was actually written by a 9/11 family member, and I'm going to just quote it. Quote, unless I read the documents wrong, it appears that there is a difference in the FBI Hardy Declaration documents describing the residence at 4224 Escondido Circle, Sarasota, Florida. In the third Hardy Declaration, the residents are described as a family headed by a wealthy international businessman. This appeared on September 4th, 2001. In the fourth Hardy Declaration, the residents are described as four Middle Eastern men living in the house leased to a Middle Eastern woman. This appeared August 27th, 2001. Meanwhile, document DE72-1 indicates once again that a family lived at the address headed by a wealthy international businessman, yet it also indicates that someone from the family had an arrest record and was a flight student at Huffman Aviation. If I am not wrong, why don't the descriptions of the occupants and their disappearances match? Did Dan Christensen look into those differences?
It's part of the problem with all this is that the documents are so heavily censored that we can't always tell. I don't know if I can make the same, draw the same conclusions that she's drawn. I didn't notice much difference in the descriptions. I mean, it seems to be pretty consistent here that there was a family here. When it talks about headed by a wealthy international businessman, they're referring, I believe, to Zawi, but things are blacked out, so we don't know for sure. And it is, some of the wording is quite unclear. I've tried to piece it together, and I'm not quite sure what they're saying. The one thing that we do know is, and that's the only thing that I think we can work with here, is, that this was the Al-Hiji's home. They were the ones that lived there. We know that from their neighbors. We know that from law enforcement. We know that from police informants that we've talked to. And we also know that they were living in a home that they did not own. It was owned by the father, who had these ties back to the royal family. So those seem to be whenever you look at documents like this, it's been my experience on many things over the years, not just in stuff like this, there are always going to be discrepancies. Somebody writes something, everybody makes mistakes from time to time. That perhaps to read the last document closely, and things filter in. It seems to me we shouldn't get distracted by those sorts of questions. We should be focusing in on the larger questions, more important questions of, frankly, what's the FBI hiding here? Why won't they talk about all this?
Right. Well, this is the problem we've been having with all the investigations. The Joint Congressional Inquiry, as you know, has 28 redacted pages that everybody's fighting to get released. The 9/11 Commission has only released 35% of its documents, and many of the documents that it has released are greatly redacted. I don't know if you're
right. I think the 28 pages should be, assuming that 28 pages gets released, should be the start, the first, part of a wider push to open up all this information.
Absolutely. I mean, Prince Bandar, I don't know if you're familiar with what a 9/11 Commission memoranda for the record is. It's just essentially just a brief description of an interview given with a witness. And Prince Bandar's
right,
on that bar.
The 9/11 Review Commission used those too, and I find it ironic that they call them memorandums for the record, yet they're not made public, so they're not part of the record.
Right, and Prince Bandar's is completely redacted, or classified, rather.
It's like, how is it on the record if nobody can see it?
Now, I'm gonna try to read through what this family member wrote. It says, again, in reading through the Fourth Hardy Declaration, it seems to me that, again, there was a pattern of these Middle Eastern men wanting to be noticed. She says these Middle Eastern men had been rude to the postal carrier, such that they were brought to the attention of the postal inspector, even though it was noted that they received very little mail. Couple that activity with their sudden disappearance after 9/11 and the package letter later received by the Middle Eastern woman Lisi at that address and returned to the post office with the name Saddam Hussein stamped on it, and to please have her mail forwarded to Saudi Arabia from then on. And she said, this family member says, maybe it's hindsight, but this MO, if you will, sounds much like that of Muhammad Atta et al., where you had Middle Eastern men throwing around money, being seen in strip clubs, arguing with bank loan officers, etc., making themselves and their backgrounds and associations, in parentheses, Middle Eastern, Saddam Hussein, Saudi Arabia, Huffman Aviation, in parentheses, memorable. So again, who actually resided at the above address, which you already talked about? Why are there supposed differing accounts? You talked about that. And why would those individuals allegedly and suspected to be engaged in plotting terrorist attacks want to put themselves on the radar of authorities of any kind, never mind leave such obvious trails prior to the attacks that might have caused the plot to be discovered and stopped? Do you have an opinion on that, or?
No, I don't. Mainly because I have heard that supposedly happened here. Because remember the hijackers, some of them were in southeast Florida, Sarasota, southwest Florida. And as a matter of fact, I don't live too far from a place where Marwan al-Shahid, it was a story, this was back before I was involved in this directly. I read a story in the paper probably years, maybe even 2 years after. It was about how the FBI had traced, they were going back looking through credit card receipts that had, to backtrack where these guys had been. One of the places they went was a Tire Kingdom store, a place where I used to take my little boys to get buy a new tire or something. It was pretty spooky. But to try and get in the heads of these people and understand why they did what they did, I don't, I don't really have a theory about that because I don't know. I'm much more interested in looking at their actions and understanding them from that rather than trying to psychoanalyze them and understand whatever the religious motives might have been behind all this that caused them to act as they did. But again, they were apparently doing the same things here. They were reportedly in strip clubs. As a matter of fact, Tony and I worked on a lead that I never wrote about, but he did put in his book, in the second edition. It was about a place over in Sarasota, but we had heard or could not verify that Al-Hiji had taken Ada and one of the other hijackers, maybe more than one. It wasn't a strip club; it was a bar where they'd pick up women and then bring them back to the house. I didn't report on it because I couldn't verify it, but Tony did put it in his book, so it's out there.
Right. This is an entry from History Commons. The entry is called Late September 2001. FBI confused about 9/11 hijackers, suspect they left deliberate trail of misleading clues. And it says, journalist Seymour Hersh will write in The New Yorker in late September 2001, quote, after more than 2 weeks of around-the-clock investigation into the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the American intelligence community remains confused, divided, and unsure about how the terrorists operated, how many there were, and what they might do next. It was that lack of solid information, government officials told me, that was the key factor behind the Bush administration's decision last week not to issue a promised white paper listing the evidence linking Osama bin Laden's organization to the attacks, end quote. An unnamed senior official tells Hersh, quote, one day we'll know, but at the moment we don't know, end quote. Hersh further reports, quote, it is widely believed that the terrorists had a support team, and the fact that the FBI has been unable to track down fellow conspirators who were left behind in the United States is seen as further evidence of careful planning. Look, one person familiar with the investigation said, if it were as simple and straightforward as a lucky one-off oddball operation, then the seeds of confusion would not have been sown as they were, end quote. The hijackers left a surprisingly obvious trail of clues, even regularly paying for delivered pizzas using credit cards in their own name. Hersh further reports, quote, many of the investigators believe that some of the initial clues that were uncovered about the terrorists' identities and preparations, such as flight manuals, were meant to be found. A former high-level intelligence official told me, whatever trail was left deliberately for the FBI to chase, end quote. Many newspaper reports... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I've always thought that it was more, they didn't care because they were going to be dead. It didn't matter.
It says, many newspaper reports in the late September 2001 indicate doubt over the identities of many of the hijackers. The 9/11 Congressional Inquiry's 2003 report will strongly suggest that the hijackers at least had numerous accomplices in the U.S., but the 9/11 Commission's 2004 report will downplay any suggestions of the U.S. accomplices and will indicate no doubts about the hijackers' identities.
That in a nutshell is what Senator Graham is most concerned about. Are there, or were there co-conspirators here that have not been caught or identified? And I think that's a valid concern. He points out repeatedly that the hijackers that we know of, and there may have been additional hijackers, and I'll talk about that in a moment, were, a lot of them didn't speak English. They had no knowledge. They'd never been here before. They had little knowledge of culture, and yet they came here and pulled off a fairly sophisticated plot. And how do you do that without assistance?
Well, my next question, apparently the two hijackers in San Diego received support from elements within Saudi Arabia's government. Both the CIA and NSA seemingly protected those two hijackers. In my opinion, that's the most honest assessment that could be given with regards to what they did. With regards to the story in Sarasota, we're told that a senior advisor to the Saudi royal family may have been connected to the hijackers in Florida. Should we be asking whether or not the system that supported the hijackers in San Diego was used to support the hijackers in Florida? And should we be looking into whether or not those hijackers were seemingly protected by elements within our government as well?
I think those are legitimate questions to ask. Personally, I cannot believe that in advance of 9/11 that hijackers were being protected by our government. I just don't. I can't buy that we would aid and abet, the slaughter of our own people.
Well, it's not. I don't know that it was to do that, but it seems that their actions protected those hijackers. Like, for instance, the NSA.
Well, not so much.
Said, go ahead.
I was going to say, not so much protecting the hijackers as protecting people who were apparently aiding and abetting them that they found out about later. Like the situation in San Diego. It seems apparent. Certainly, again, Senator Graham believes that this was a significant operation out there. And one of the things he was critical of the FBI was they wouldn't allow the joint inquiry to question certain people that had information about all this because they were under the FBI's thumb on this. And apparently because the FBI was doing the bidding of the Bush administration to lay off the Saudis on all this. That's what it seemed. That's how this whole thing seems to have unfolded. And now perhaps the FBI regrets doing that, and they're covering up the fact that they looked bad back then.
Well, what I'm referring to with regard, right, with regards to what I'm referring to as far as protection goes, are you familiar with Alex Station?
No.
Okay, Alex Station was the Bin Laden unit, the CIA's Bin Laden unit, and they got information that one of the hijackers from San Diego got a U.S. visa, and there were two FBI agents assigned to Alex Station. One of them was Doug Miller, one of them was Mark Rossini, and one of them asked the CIA people there if they could send a memo to the FBI notifying them that one of the hijackers had a visa. And Tom Wilshire from the CIA told Michael and Casey to tell this FBI agent, no, you cannot send a memo notifying the FBI. Later in the day, that same CIA official sent out a memo within the CIA notifying them that the FBI had been notified. So that's one instance. The CIA withheld information from the FBI about those hijackers, I believe, for a while.
Right, but nobody at the time knew they were going to hijack. That's what I'm getting at here.
No, but the story the theory that's being put forward is that the CIA was trying to flip them. That was put forward by Richard Clark, but I don't know. Or were they working in collaboration with the Saudis to try and flip these individuals because apparently George Tenet wanted to get somebody in Al-Qaeda on their side or something to that effect?
Well, I think if you operate under the assumption that these intelligence agencies, which includes the FBI, are constantly trying to flip people and turn them into informants, that's how they operate. That is, that's what they do. And
no,
as a result
I understand.
That's why you can't necessarily trust. We sort of think the FBI enforces the law and wants to arrest the bad guys. Well, that's only partially true. What they want to do is they want to become and have ever since 2001 wanted to become the domestic intelligence agency here, which that's one of the things that the Review Commission talked about. That's one of the things that the 9/11 Commission recommended, which I wonder if that's something we really want. But the point is, my point simply being that, the old-fashioned notion of, hey, you tell them about it, they'll go out and arrest the bad guys, is out of date. They're much more interested in developing sources of information that they can build on and, continue to use forever.
Well, the problem is that, if the CIA was trying to flip those two hijackers, they were operating on American soil, which they were not allowed to do. So that's one problem. And now with regards to the NSA and protecting them, the NSA said that they could only identify where the calls that the hijackers were making were going to, which were to the hub in Yemen. They monitored or recorded about 8 phone calls. They said they can only identify where they were going to, which was the hub in Yemen. But the fact is, according to NSA whistleblower William Binney and also Thomas Drake, they were well aware where the calls were coming from, which meant that they knew that the 2 hijackers were in the United States, and they didn't tell the FBI. So that's another, and somebody mentioned or suggested that the NSA and CIA were collaborating to try and flip these people, but I don't know. I don't know why the NSA lied, But anyway.
Well, you had asked a minute ago, should we be asking whether or not the system that supported the hijackers in San Diego was used to support them in Florida? That, again, is another key question that Graham keeps bringing up. He believes the answer is yes. When Tony and I originally went to him to tell him about this, he thought that this seemed to be somewhat of a mirror image as to what happened in San Diego, and that this was, something that he had suspected for a long time, that there was, additional locations around the country where there was support for the hijackers. That's why he thinks this is so significant, because it tends to show that indeed that was the case here.
Well, the next part of this question comes from a family member. To date, we know the FBI still has not addressed the many contradictions, omissions in evidence, plots, suspects, witnesses, whistleblowers in either the 9/11 Commission's investigation or that of the Joint Inquiry. Thus, I would expect nothing of value to come of their latest investigative farce, and she's referring to the 9/11 Review Commission. It was most likely a waste of time and money, and another slap in the face of those 9/11 families still seeking truth and justice with regards to the attacks. Whose or what agenda did it address, in your opinion?
What, meaning the 9/11 Review Commission?
Yeah.
It seemed to address the FBI's agenda, frankly. Like I say, it had mild criticism of the FBI, and as a matter of fact, Director Comey, after this was released, he basically came out and said what a great report it was, and said, oh, by the way, they're criticizing the same things that I've criticized, that we need to do things better, which is sort of a general criticism that doesn't mean anything. So yeah, I think it ended up being turned and used by the FBI to pat itself on the back and make itself look good, largely. And also, in the case of Sarasota, it was used to discredit a document that essentially contradicted everything that the FBI had said publicly about all of this. It's a very strange thing. I've never seen the FBI repudiate one of its own documents before, nor explain why it released to the public a document that it says was bad.
Well, you released a story today talking about getting the individual who wrote that report to, I guess, testify or be questioned?
Right. Well, in our Freedom of Information lawsuit, our attorneys filed a paperwork today that asks the judge. Let me back up for a moment. We asked the assistant United States attorney in Miami, who is, defending the government on this, whether or not we could interview the agent, who has been criticized for issuing what they referred to as a report that was wholly unsubstantiated. And this is a person they didn't identify, So we don't know who it is. We have suspicion who it might be, but we don't know who it is. And we wanted to talk to them and find out why did they tell the FBI that they had no basis for writing this report. It's a fairly detailed report, some of which remains classified due to national security. Due to national security reasons. Why would they make something up here? The question that the lawyers have here is we need to talk with them to find out, because it's possible that the FBI ordered this person not to talk. That's why there's no explanation there. The whole thing just doesn't add up, okay? And we want to talk to whoever this agent is and find out why he said what he said, or what he allegedly said.
Okay. Now, Paul Sperry just reported that, quote, the Saudi 9/11 connection in Florida was no small part of the overall 9/11 investigation, yet it was never shared with Congress, nor was it mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, end quote. And the Herald Tribune recently posted a statement by Paul Wisipal,
the Sarasota Herald Tribune, correct.
Okay, special agent in charge of the FBI's Tampa field office. In that statement, he says that, quote, all the documents and records gathered during the 9/11 investigation, including information regarding the Sarasota home and family, were made available to both the Joint Intelligence Committee inquiry and the 9/11 Commission, end quote. So that's a contradiction. Which is it? Did they get it or didn't they? It doesn't sound like they did, based on what Bob Graham is saying.
Correct. I also talked to Lee Hamilton about this, and he hadn't heard of any of this. So what Senator Graham did, too, was after we reported all this, went to him, reported the first few stories, he contacted the FBI and asked them, saying, okay, you guys say you provided this to us. Can you help us identify when, tracking numbers and things that will allow us to identify this material so we can go back and find it and, evaluate it? And they never did. They could not document when they turned it over, how they turned it over, or provide any tracking data for that. He went to the National Archives, too, and there was nothing there about this, according to the people at the National Archives.
Wow.
That's where, by the way, that's where their documentation for the for the joint inquiry, I think, was kept.
Well, that's where it's also being kept for the 9/11 Commission's documents at the National Archives. Now, according to a report by you and Anthony Summers from June 5th, 2013, it says, quote, Graham said the FBI kept the 9/11 Commission in the dark, too. He said co-chairman Thomas Keene and Lee Hamilton and executive director Philip Zelikow all told him they were unaware of the FBI's Sarasota investigation, end quote.
Right.
Now, one thing about the 9/11 Commission, I believe with regards to Able Danger, they originally said that they were completely unaware of it, that they never spoke to anybody about Able Danger, and it turned out that they did. So I don't know that I entirely trust what they're saying, but regardless.
Well, the bottom line seems to me that the FBI has made this assertion, yet they have not backed it up. They certainly haven't backed it up with me. It's like, okay, you say you turned this over, well, where is it? Why will they not discuss the basis for their statements here? You have to remember, they are saying, when you go back to square one on this, okay, first of all, they conducted a secret investigation into these Saudi folks living in Sarasota at the time, okay? When we did the first story, we spoke with them, we spoke to them after. We contacted the Department of Justice for the story, and they declined to comment on it. But they did not disclose this investigation when they first put out their first statement on this, which was a day or two after the initial story. They confirmed that indeed they had conducted an investigation. They However, they said that there was nothing to the investigation. They found no connection to the 9/11 plot or the 9/11 hijackers. And then they also added, in response to Senator Graham, that, oh, by the way, we turned over everything to the 9/11 Commission and to Congress on this. And, well, you know, how come nobody ever heard of this investigation until we wrote about it? They turned it over. If they turned it over, they did it in some way that nobody bothered to, and nobody could recognize the significance of it, because they showed they were interested afterwards.
Are you aware of everything the 9/11 Commission did to hinder investigations into Saudi Arabia's possible
No, I haven't
role?
No, I have to remember, I'm a reporter. I cover lots of things. I operate a website in South Florida that looks at local news here too. So no, I've not done a study of the 9/11 thing. All I know is that this particular aspect of it is weird.
Well, you're the first reporter that's actually writing current stories about one of the cover-ups of 9/11 that I've had on this show. Do you think you might start pointing out to people, like, or looking into the ridiculousness of the 9/11 Commission or some of the lies?
Well, I've looked at the ridiculousness, shall we say, of the 9/11 Review Commission, but I mean, the 9/11 Commission itself, no, I doubt if I'll be looking at that, because, number one, I write about contemporary news. This is news. These are things that are happening now, okay? But we also have problems here in South Florida with, like, bid rigging at the local school board and, you know, things like that. That's our principal focus here. I got involved in this because Tony came to me, and then it's been this, you know, journalistically, it's been the story that's kept on giving here. And there's been no, as you say, been very little coverage of this in the national media. So
absolutely. There's none.
Yeah. Well, lately there had, I mean, the New York Times story, it's funny, you see a story that ran on page 5 or 6 about Bob Graham has generated a lot of coverage. I mean, when, you know, story gets in there about stuff, it causes response. And we report it. We're not as well known as the New York Times, so it gets around, but it doesn't get around like it does when it's in the New York Times. So I'm hoping that they might roar. I mean, that's the first time that Sarasota and 9/11 were ever mentioned in the same breath, I think, by a really, you know, one of the biggest papers in the country.
Well, the stories like this, to me, need to get the attention that, say, Michael Jackson's death got or Britney Spears' haircut gets. And it boggles my mind that it doesn't. You're
preaching to the choir on that one.
Okay, good. Are you aware of the history of the United States government enabling and protecting and collaborating with Saudi Arabia with regards to their connections to terrorism?
Well, I don't know about in terms of their connections with terrorism, but clearly we have long and interesting history with them. It seems like the principal motivating factors is we want their oil and they want our arms. When you boil everything away, that's what the whole relationship is about. If they had no oil, we wouldn't care about them particularly.
Well, it's not just the oil, it's also their money, and not just for arms, but, you know, the Bush family had business dealings with them. Hillary Clinton, I understand, is like one of their biggest benefactors for an organization she belongs to. They got like $25 million from...
Yeah, that's why it's quite disturbing here that apparently, I mean, there keep being stories. There's another story today in the Times or somewhere about, you know, the connections here and the money. I mean, ultimately, when I use oil equals money, certainly. You have to be concerned about the effects of potential foreign influence on our elections in the United States.
Well, absolutely. But what I'm talking about is, like, during the 90s, there was an FBI agent who started an investigation into terrorist financing called vulgar betrayal, and that was eventually shut down. And he was getting close to the Saudis and so forth. George Tenet developed ties with Prince Bandar. He would have meetings with him that his subordinates weren't aware of, what they talked about. And in fact, we're told to kind of back off the Saudis. We collaborated with them as far as arming Bosnian Muslims in the 90s and other things. And when George Bush first came into office, one of the first things he did, according to Greg Palast, was to tell the different alphabet agencies to back off the Saudis and the bin Ladens. So, we've been protecting or enabling them for years, before 9/11 and after 9/11.
I got to tell you, I don't know anything about all those relationships. I suppose I've read some of the same things you have, but as a reporter, I don't know anything about them.
Okay. Now, in a written report by you on July 1st, 2014, you write that, quote, the April 2002 FBI report contains additional new information. The deletions make its full meaning difficult to discern. It says that the Tampa FBI office, quote, has determined that blank is an antagonist of the United States of America. Blank resides in Jerusalem. Blank allegedly has held regularly and recurring meetings at his residence to denounce and criticize the United States of America and its policies. Blank is allegedly an international businessman with great wealth, end quote. Do you know the name of this individual?
No, I don't. I'd like to know, though.
Right.
Are they referring to Ghazawi? I don't think he has great wealth, so I don't think it's him. But I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
That's what's so frustrating about the documents that get released. They release and more so than that. The thing that's the oddest thing of this whole situation, this whole reporting situation for me, okay, is the original stories that we wrote were not based on any documentation. It was based on sources, okay? The intelligence agent, counterintelligence or counterterrorist agent that I mentioned. There was a gentleman whose name we did use. His name was Larry Berberick. He was a wealthy guy who lived in that development, but was also heading up as administrator, heading up security for them. He was the guy that turned over the gatehouse photographs and records to the FBI, which the source later informed us, showed these connections to the hijackers, and yet none of that stuff has showed up in any of these documents that we got later from the FBI. So it's a real, I don't know, it's a real puzzle. And you look at all this information that has been released, information that they originally said they didn't have, and then they did release. And one of the things that they did release, when we looked at it when it first came out, this idea where it talked about how there were many connections to from this family to the terrorists, we wondered, why did they release that piece of information, that tidbit of information? Because it was so damning of what their public statements had been. It was almost like somebody on the inside wanted to get that out and somehow managed to get it out to us. So, again...
Well, we need more people like that, obviously.
If that's what happened. That was just a theory that we had. It was like, why was this released to us? And now they're turning around and saying, oh, never mind, it was BS. And we don't, I don't believe that for a minute, because that we use that document as confirming to what we had heard, prior to that. It wasn't like that, that was a revelation to us. It was merely a confirm to us that what we had been hearing was correct.
Right.
So when the 9/11 Review Commission sought to poo-poo it and didn't bother to look at any of the other stuff that we had reported, they didn't mention, Bob Graham's allegations that none of this was ever told to Congress. They didn't look at any of the other allegations. They didn't look at the fact that the original story dealt with sources saying that all these things had occurred. They didn't question the fact that the FBI says there's nothing to this, yet doesn't produce the gatehouse records that the source told us do show these things. Why not, if there's nothing to this, why not just come out and show us? And if there's nothing to this, why are you censoring documents citing national security?
The same things with regards to the 28 redacted pages that apparently the 9/11 Commission looked at the allegations within the 28 redacted pages and found that they were lacking. Okay, if there's nothing to what's in those pages, why don't you release them?
Exactly. Same argument. And that makes sense. By the way, we are involved in a legal push. It's a parallel legal push. In addition to the FOIA lawsuit, which is focused specifically on getting access to the FBI files on what happened in Sarasota, we also are pursuing for the last year and a half, what's called as a mandatory declassification review. It's a little known. I didn't know anything about it. The Bulldog's great First Amendment lawyer, a guy named Tom Julin, who's in Miami, was aware of this, and it is kind of a freedom of information like device in which you can request that agencies reconsider certain documents and move to declassify them. And so we filed this. You have to go through the agencies that have the documents. In this case, the 28 pages. It was determined the FBI had them, so we asked the FBI. They ignored us after a certain time period went past. We went to the Justice Department. They ignored us. After another certain time period passed, it landed before what's called the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, which is a mouthful, right? But it's basically made of members from various agencies, including the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of State, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Council, and also the National Archives. Excuse me.
Right.
We did some look at them, or Tom did some look at them, and found they are not a rubber stamp, okay? Which was interesting. They have released a bunch of information. Matter of fact, they released some new 9/11 information just a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, we are waiting for them to decide whether or not the 28 pages should be recommended for release. And if they decide that that's the case, then they will recommend that to the president. And that should shake things up a little bit here.
I spoke to, or he interviewed Brian McGlinchey, who is the founder of 28pages.org, and he spoke about what you just spoke about. And he said that he doesn't have a good feeling about it because of the individuals that are involved in the process.
Right.
Very much
well,
so.
We don't. The bottom line is we don't know. All we can do is look at the track record, that they don't routinely just, say no. They do say yes. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they said yes on was I personally found kind of interesting. It's a little bit of a side, has nothing to do with the 28 pages of Sarasota, but they released a couple of weeks ago, and you can go on their website and see it, a number of documents that have been requested, I think, by History Commons regarding what appeared to be the efforts or the lack of efforts to stop the planes, the hijacked planes, intercept them. And one of the things, there was an interview with a general, a guy who was in charge of the 1st Air Force Command. And in that thing, the part of it that I read, he was talking about the fact that how fortunate it was that the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, grounded all the planes back then, or he said surely there would have been more loss of life because they believed that there was at least another plane that was about to be hijacked. And said that they found box cutters and stuff. Now, there's been stories out there about, possibility of another plane. In fact, Tony Summers reported on that in the 11th day. There was apparently a plane at JFK. I think it was United 23, and there were 4 Middle Eastern men that were on that plane who were not happy when the plane didn't take off. Initially refused to get off the plane and ultimately left the place before the cops could show up. So it's interesting that there's new little tidbits out there that continue to come out, and in this case came out because of this, what they call ice cap panel. And so we're hopeful, we don't know, but we're hopeful that because given all the statements that we've heard about the 28 pages from everybody, all these different legislators who have read it, including Graham and Senator Shelby, who was his co-chair back then, there's nothing or very little in those 28 pages that is about national security and that's legitimately, should remain outside the public purview here. So we are hoping that they give a good look, that they'll give a fair look, and they'll say, hey, let's open this. And in fact, it could be possible that this would be a device that the administration could use to release it and do it in a way that wouldn't alienate the Saudis.
Well, from what I understand, this process that you're talking about, they can only recommend, really, that they be released. Uh-huh. Is that correct? And the president would then have to decide. The president can release them anytime he wanted to, from what I understand.
This would perhaps give some political cover, shall we say?
Right, but he's already promised, like 9/11 family members, Kristen Broward and Bill Doyle, that he would release them. And, his administration fought against the families or sided with the Saudis over the families regarding a lawsuit years ago.
Right.
By having Alina Kagan, go to the Supreme Court, who was the Solicitor General at the time, and tell them not to hear the case, and so on and so forth.
Let's put
again,
it this
that goes back to the protection of the Saudis that I was talking about.
Right. But if it turns out that the president would like to be able to release this, honor his promise to them, this might offer a way for it to be done and have some deniability there. Hey, this wasn't, this is what the panel said. I felt I had no choice, blah, blah, blah. Who knows?
Right.
Those are situations that, are way beyond my pay grade here.
Is there anything about this story, the Sarasota story, that we haven't addressed that you think people need to know about?
Well, I think I've talked about as much as I know about it. I think there's more to know. There was a sidelight that came out in one of the documents that I wrote a story about a year or so ago about in the nearby city of Bradenton after the, about a month, I think it was on Halloween of 2001, there were, cops found some other materials that had been abandoned by some guy or had been thrown in a dumpster by a guy from Tunisia that, indicated that he might have been a hijacker or was thinking about doing a hijacking of some kind. This was information that was in there that they put out, but we don't know the name of the person. I tried to run it down a little bit, but I couldn't. But there's a story on floridabulldog.org. If you do a search, you can find it.
Are there any actions people should be taking with regards to this issue?
Senator Graham has been urging people. Matter of fact, he wrote a column that appeared in the Tampa Bay Times about this over the weekend, explaining what's going on and urging people to contact their congressman to let them know about this and essentially put in a vote for opening up to 28 pages. And that sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. And one of the things that 28pages.org has been pointing out is that there are so few representatives that have been willing to go even read the 28 redacted pages. So obviously more need to do that.
Yeah, well, that's depressing if that's true.
Right.
You would think that people would, care about this. And
you would think.
To find out what's happened here. I mean, our people were murdered, and we need to know what happened. We need to get to the bottom of this, and we don't need to be lied to by our government. And that's
exactly.
I'm a guy. Look, this may sound a little sappy here because I'm this tough investigative reporter, but I have always felt that I was hearing things straight for the most part from law enforcement when I dealt with them. There were always some certain exceptions to that, but this goes way beyond anything I have ever seen. I mean, the FBI is taking extreme steps to, frankly, cover this up, and that goes from basically denying, or number one, hiding this investigation in the first place for more than a decade until we reported about it, Tony and I. And then to come out and say that there was nothing to it when quite obviously there was something to it. And, most recently here, this 9/11 Review Commission entity that comes out and basically tries to discount all this in a very disingenuous way. They did not look at fully at the evidence that we have presented on this. And by the way, when I tried to, after the report came out, and I did a story about how they were sort of under the FBI's thumb, I called the executive director, I called the 3 commissioners, and others, trying to get them to talk about this. I didn't go in with any preconceived notion, and they wouldn't talk to me. It's like, I had one of the guys, a guy named Bruce Hoffman. He's a professor of security studies at Georgetown, a guy who teaches for a living, who you would think would be interested in explaining his rationale for stuff. And I called him up, and he said, I told him my name. He obviously was aware of it. He said, I'm not interested in talking to you, and he hung up on me. I mean, that does not inspire confidence that we're getting a fair shake, members of the American public here.
I always ask people, what qualifies as suspicious behavior?
That qualifies.
Exactly. There's so much. There's so many actions like that with regards to 9/11 that it just boggles the mind. Anyway, Dan, I want to go ahead.
I was going to say, there was one other thing that was interesting, and it even made it into an editorial in the Sarasota Herald Tribune. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that the title of this was, and this was after the 9/11 Review Commission did its thing, they wrote an editorial that was headlined, "The FBI's Suspicious Behavior." I believe that's exactly what they said. And that was a remarkable thing to see. It ended up prompting that Paul Weissapol guy, or however he pronounces his name, who's the special agent in charge of the Tampa office, to come out and, dispute that. In what they referred to as a guest column that I would think had to be cleared by Washington. I wouldn't think that the head of the FBI office would do anything like that without getting clearance from Washington.
It was probably ordered by Washington.
Could have been that too. I don't know. But let's put it this way. I have never, ever seen anything like that before. Nor has Senator Graham, nor has my attorney. There are all these very unusual things that are happening about all this. And that's part of the mystery here. Why is all this happening? We don't know.
Well, they're covering up incompetence, criminality. I mean, who knows? That's the thing, is that there has been such a lack of accountability with regards to the 9/11 attacks. You want to talk about the intelligence failures, quote, failures before 9/11. Nobody was held accountable for any of these things. People that didn't deserve it were rewarded and promoted in many cases. it's just, again, it's just such a weird situation, such a suspicious situation with regards to the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, and if I might just add one other thing too, that it's not just about Sarasota here. Okay, this 9/11 Review Commission, they went through it. If you look at the report, and you see basically this, what I refer to as sort of mild criticism, and basically, hey, you should be doing things faster, but other than that, you're doing things pretty well. That, and then they also went off on Sarasota and some other lead, but I didn't think that was an honest evaluation of the FBI's performance here, because one of the things that they didn't talk about were all the significant troubles reported not by me but by others, by the New York Times, the Washington Post, in their transformation here into more of an intelligence agency. One of the things that they have done was they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a new system to find documents and things like that. It's called the Sentinel system, and that whole thing was a giant mess up for quite some time, and I still don't know if they've got it down. I still think there's problems with it, but it's like this is their central document tracing system, and yet it's not functioning the way that it's supposed to, or certainly wasn't until very recently. And yet there was not a word that I saw of critical analysis of that in this basically cheerleading report by the 9/11 Review Commission, which to me tells you what the 9/11 Review Commission was all about.
Well, if you remember, I mentioned that FBI Director Robert Mueller put on a charm offensive with the 9/11 Commission after being so uncooperative and so forth. And this is from Phil Sheenan's book. It says, quote, Mueller was also aware of how much fear the FBI continued to inspire among Washington's powerful, and how even after 9/11, that fear dampened public criticism. Members of Congress shrank at the thought of attacking the FBI. For many on Capitol Hill, there was always the assumption that there was an embarrassing FBI file somewhere with your name on it, ready to be leaked at just the right moment. More than one member of the 9/11 Commission admitted privately that they had joked and worried among themselves about the danger of being a little too publicly critical of the Bureau, end quote. So there are a lot of problems with the FBI. I mean, we can get into the entrapment issues with regards to terrorism and a whole bunch of things. Supposedly after 9/11, John Ashcroft reinstated COINTELPRO, which was a bad thing, So
Yep.
Anyway, Dan, I want to thank you very much for all of the reporting that you're doing. I want to wish you luck with future endeavors with regards to that reporting, and I want you to keep it up. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time today to be on my show. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Not really, except to remind folks that they can see us at floridabulldog.org, and to also just tell them that, hey, we are a not-for-profit, essentially a charity, and we rely on contributions. So if there are folks out there that can help us, we'd like to hire more staff to write more stories, and also perhaps free me up a bit to be able to do more of this 9/11 reporting. So if there are folks out there that have the means, can help us out, they can send a check to the P.O. box that's on our website. You can even, there's a button on site where you can actually use a credit card to donate like that.
So there you go. You can go and support the Florida Bulldog and their reporting on this very important issue. All right, Dan, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, John, very nice. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.